Week 5, Unit 9, Exercise 1. At its most fundamental, relative brightness identifies the visual contrasts by which we live. Without contrast, the essentials of vision fail to operate. The brain will not identify edges and forms nor perceive depth or distance. The fewer the contrasts, the less able we are to identify details, and the less able we are to navigate the environment. Ideal visual conditions are those where contrasts of relative brightness are most easily identified, where the light source is strong and casts sharply defined shadows. It follows that ideal visual conditions are most likely to generate positive feeling responses. At the opposite end of the safe-dangerous spectrum, the most hazardous visual conditions are those where the contrasts given by a range of relative brightness no longer exist. Complete darkness, as in an underground cave, and complete brightness, as in a blizzard whiteout, are equally filled with danger. In these extreme conditions of brightness, details are erased and navigation becomes hazardous. Emotion feelings aroused by conditions such as these are most likely to be negative. Exercise 2. The most important inherent limitation on patentable subject matter revolves around the sometimes blurred distinction between an invention and a discovery. Laws of nature or scientific principles that a researcher may find are not patentable. For example, imagine that a scientist discovers that a certain previously unknown form of magnetic wave strikes the Earth's atmosphere from deep space, and that this kind of wave has an adverse effect on the transmission of data between the Earth and communications satellites. Such a discovery may have enormous commercial implications, perhaps leading to the invention of a device that filters out the harmful effect of the waves. The inventor of the filtering device may be entitled to a patent. The discoverer of the magnetic wave cannot patent his or her discovery. Today, the distinction between discovery and invention is of increasing importance in the fields of genetic engineering and biotechnology. Exercise 3. Farm animals, lab animals, sport horses. Our language, when we refer to some animals, often focuses on their exploitation and on the benefits humans get from them. For example, animals as a source of food used in biomedical research or for recreational activities. When we refer to some animals as pets, are we implying their use for any purpose? A pet can be defined in a neutral manner as an animal that lives with humans. Another largely used term is companion animal, which, again, implies that we keep them in our home with the final aim of getting companionship. Some may argue that a fish in the fish tank is not really anyone's companion. However, this term well adapts to domestic species such as dogs and cats, which we treat kindly, consider as members of the family and our best friends, and with whom we share our time and financial resources. Differently from other species, companion animals thus appear to represent an emotional rather than an economical resource, providing humans with support, comfort, and companionship. When it comes to animal discourse, our language typically emphasizes the utility of some animals, whereas the terms for those kept in homes suggest their rational significance. Exercise 4. Whilst some stakeholders may try to protect the integrity of arts and cultural festivals from their reconfiguration as urban policy tools, we should recognize that policy-oriented festivals can still have very positive social and cultural effects, and we cannot ignore the fact that some festivals were established to strategically assist urban areas. In other words, they have always been strategic interventions rather than artistic, social, or cultural phenomena. Film festivals are a good example. Many of these events were established for economic reasons. For example, the Cannes Film Festival was launched to prolong the tourist season. The Brighton Festival was created for similar reasons. The re-establishment of the Venice Carnival in 1979, following a long break, was also a deliberate attempt to address some of the issues the city was facing at that time, including the lack of provision for young people. These festivities have not been appropriated as urban policy tools. They have always been staged with wider objectives in mind. Exercise 5 and 6. You may have heard a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. While it is true that each calorie yields the same amount of energy, foods can be metabolized and used differently, some more efficiently than others. For example, carbohydrates, protein, and fat, the macronutrients that provide calories, can each have different effects on the hormones and brain centers that control hunger and eating behavior. Macronutrients have standard amounts of calories. 1 gram of protein has 4 calories. 1 gram of carbohydrates has 4 calories. 1 gram of fat has 9 calories. However, the source is important. There are many compounds in foods besides the macronutrients that can influence your body's process and response mechanisms. Even though each gram of carbohydrates provides 4 calories per gram, not all carbohydrates are created equal. For example, white bread has been refined and stripped of its fiber. Because of this, white bread may cause a spike in blood sugar, whereas whole grain bread is less processed and has its fiber intact. This allows for a slower release of sugar into the blood, meaning that while white and whole grain bread may have the same amount of carbohydrates, the way they affect your blood sugar is very different. Exercise 7. Sentiment is very close to emotion in meaning. But when social psychologists use the term sentiment, they emphasize the social aspect of emotion. Early social psychologists used sentiment to refer to components of human responses that separate them from analogous responses that animals would have. For example, Cooley contrasts love and lust. Although lust is instinctive, we learn what love is through social interaction. In other words, sentiment relies not just on the responses of the individual to the stimulus, but also on how other human beings understand that stimulus. In later years, as social psychologists have come to increasingly accept that social elements are a key piece of emotions, the idea of sentiment has become less distinguishable from that of emotion. In contemporary work, social psychologists often use the term sentiment to distinguish immediate emotional responses from longer-term emotional states such as love, grief, and jealousy. These sentiments can endure for days, weeks, and even years after the initial event that triggered them. Exercise 8. To become a fossil is a long and involved process and is an unlikely outcome for the vast majority of individuals. The most obvious requirement for an organism to end up as a fossil is that it must become entombed within rock, usually by burial. There are many chances that can prevent this happening. If a mollusk with 2 shells has the misfortune to be killed by a predator, then the soft parts will be eaten. The predator will probably have to break at least one of the shells to gain access to the flesh, so it is unlikely that both shells will survive intact. Even if they do, the 2 shells may become separated. On the other hand, if the organism dies a natural death, although the soft parts of the body will almost certainly rot away, neither shell is likely to be damaged. The shells are held together at the hinge by fibrous tissues, which are among the last to rot, so there is a reasonable chance that the 2 shells will remain held together until they become buried. Exercise 9. Sometimes a monkey grooms another monkey and gets nothing in return. Sometimes an ape courts a mate and gets completely ignored. Cortisol prompts a mammal to try something different, but after a few disappointments, it can be hard for the mammal to predict where to invest its energy. This is why we often fall back on the neural superhighways we myelinated in youth. Your electricity flows effortlessly down the pathways built by behaviors that were reliably rewarded in your past. Maybe it was scoring a touchdown or joining friends to watch your favorite quarterback score. Of course, carrying a ball across a line does not meet real survival needs, but dopamine surges when you expect a social reward. Each brain predicts social rewards from its own life experience. Maybe you lived in a world where social rewards went to someone who cooked a big meal or solved a big equation or found a bar open after hours. There are limitless ways to get social rewards, but the ones we observe and enjoy in youth build expectations that last. Just as repeated social disappointments can lead individuals to return to familiar behaviors reinforced in their youth, the brain relies on past experiences and neural pathways to predict and seek out rewarding experiences. Exercise 10. To determine whether a person is lying, we tend to rely heavily on intuition. Unless we catch a lie on factual grounds, the only indicators of a person's dishonesty are tone of voice, body language, and facial expressions, signs that may be too subtle for us to consciously recognize, but that can still evoke a strong gut feeling. The problem is that while we can practice our skills at evaluating others' truthfulness in social interactions without clear feedback on whether our judgments are correct, we don't know if we're erring on the side of gullibility or of distrustfulness. This means we're unable to improve over time. Though many people believe they're quite good at distinguishing truths from lies, almost no one in the general population performs with higher than chance accuracy. On average, even police officers, lawyers, judges, psychiatrists, and members of other groups that encounter more frequent and serious lies than ordinary people perform no better. Exercise 11 and 12. In ancient times, not each and every kind of suffering warranted pity. No one was supposed to feel pity for captured, tortured, and killed enemies. Neither slaves nor Christian martyrs deserved pity. Later on, religious communities that preached the gospel of brotherly love and love of neighbor found no difficulty in denying it to those who did not belong and believe. This attitude only started to change during the 18th century. Playwrights, reviving the Aristotelian concept of catharsis, discovered pity as the most natural and most moral human faculty that should be cultivated by theater, literature, and music. Philosophers who sought a moral foundation for modern civil society praised pity and sympathy as counterforces of self-love and egoism. Novelists were eager to devise plots and stories that would elicit the reader's pity, inspiring them to become sensitive and sensible citizens. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of European and North American men and women campaigned for the ending of slavery and the liberation of slaves, fueled by an imagined empathy and using a language of love for those brothers and sisters whose freedom and human dignity were violated. They engaged in an unprecedented and ultimately successful struggle against the slave trade and the institution of slavery.